everyone, it's Zach GP here and welcome back to another post FP2 video for F1 Fantasy ahead of the deadline for the Japanese Grand Prix. And for all of your F1 Fantasy needs, you can find me on this channel, Zach GP, and over on FanAmp where I do my preview and an hour before qualifying for our final deadline streams. But like always, I'm going to go straight to the point on what teams you should be building, who you shouldn't be going near, which teams are sticking out all after the FP2 session, as we all know, FP2 is the most important, especially to sort of figure out exactly where everyone's going to qualify. So let's get into it. Right, so straight away, no dilly-dallying. I'll explain later down the line why it's exactly like this. But in your teams, they should consist of these assets I'm about to name, and if anyone I haven't mentioned is not on that list, do not bring them into your team. A tier driver-wise, Norris, Russell, Piastri. A tier constructors, McLaren and Mercedes. B tier drivers, Ocon, Stroll, Behrman and Hulkenberg. Middle ground of not terrible but not the best to have in your team would be HADJAR and Bortoleto and Yuki Tsunoda. And then B tier constructors, Haas, Racing Bulls, Williams. Do not bring any other assets into your teams. So the rule of thumb coming into Japan, as you can see from the people I've told you to choose, is if they are a driver slash constructor asset that looks like they're going to increase in price 0.3 or 0.6, you bring them into your team. And you don't look at anyone else like Ferrari, like Alpine, those sorts of teams who look like they're going to decrease in value. So straight away, McLaren definitely look like the asset to bring in. But who do you bring in, Norris or Piastri? Well, now, first of all, a lot of it does come down to what sort of team you have, because Norris and Piastri aren't the ones you want to be messing about with if you've got other drivers in your team such as Gasly, Albon, doing that you need to get rid of to make sure that the rest of your team is okay. But if it boils down to you have one transfer available and you can either pick Norris or Piastri, my money is still on Norris, as Norris looked amazing in that second sector and then he had a bit of a scruffy sector 3. So I still think Lando Norris has the pure pace beat for Piastri this weekend. However, it is very close and realistically it comes down to your gut feeling of who do you think is going to do better. I think Lando Norris, but very much if you want to go for a sort of Oscar Piastri team where you can't afford to have Lando Norris, Piastri still looks extremely good as well. You've got to have either one of them. For me, it's Lando Norris right now. So straight away, after FP2, a driver you shouldn't be going near. I've already said you shouldn't because I didn't mention him in the list, but Jack Doohan is a no-go, and even Alpine at this point. Now, the crash in FP2 didn't really look like it was exactly his fault, but that's what makes Alpine as well a little bit of a worry, as if their car can lose that grip going into turn 1 that easily, I could very much see them crashing again in qualifying or the race, just having issues. Luckily he is okay. I don't think he's worth going anywhere near. He wasn't before anyway, and the same applies to Alpine. And then in a similar situation, Fernando Alonso is a same sort of scenario. He's DNF'd in the last 2 races. He then went off and beached his car in FP2. It's just not the start to the season he wants. So with that negative 0.6 for Alonso basically being dead set for him, again, he's a no-go after FP2. And it's going to be a little bit weird because there's a lot of stuff I can talk about. Red flags in FP2. A lot of the data is a bit skewed, so we have to take everything with a bit of a pinch of salt. So another big one is you need McLaren. It's as simple as that. They looked great in FP2. They've looked good in Australia. They look good in China. They look like the best car 100%. And realistically, we haven't still seen a full weekend with them at their best. There's always been some sort of issue with either one of the drivers. So coming into Japan, I think it's going to be the exact same story where you need at least 2 McLaren assets in your team. One of Norris or Piastri, depending on your budget. And then more importantly, you need McLaren as a constructor. 71 points in Australia, 101 points in China. It's a no-brainer. Look at Mercedes. They're the next closest team and it's not even close. So points-wise, they're well above the rest of the grid. And then budget-wise, they need minus 61 points to not get a 0.3 million increase, which, if you couldn't guess, would have to be disqualifications in both qualifying and race for it to happen. So it's almost physically impossible for McLaren not to get that 0.3 increase for your team budget. And then I drone on about this quite a bit in these post FP2 videos, but I'm going to talk about how budget is key again. Now, for me, it depends where a lot of people are, but for the general idea, this is the last weekend where we are going to be seeing a lot of big budget building teams. We're still going to see it throughout the season. However, past Japan is where we're going to really see the effects of budgeting early on in the season, with teams being able to bring in a lot of budget drivers, including Piastri, McLaren and Mercedes. And to help you get to all of these teams is quite easy. Now, I'll go through the algorithm that F1 Fantasy Tools believes to be correct. However, again, like usual, you don't really need to fully understand it for anyone who doesn't really grasp the maths on it. You just need to have this cheat sheet with you, which I will be putting in the videos from now on, with all of the points needed to increase or decrease your driver value. You can also find this on F1 Fantasy Tools. So the algorithm is now pre-race average. So let's take George Russell's points for instance. 25, 35 plus 18, which is what George Russell would need to get to that 0.3 increase. 78 divided by 3 is 26, and then divide it by the price of the asset, which for George Russell is 21.4. So 26 divided by 21.4 equals 1.215, which is just above that 1.2 threshold. And then quickly, still on that algorithm, A tier drivers are believed to be 19 million and above, and B tiers are the flip of that, which is anything below 19 million. But again, like I mentioned, I'm going to be putting at the bottom of my video throughout the whole video now, A tier drivers, B tier drivers, A tier constructors, and B tier constructors. These are the points they need for this weekend. Again, if you want to see exactly where I got this, it's on F1 Fantasy Tools. Go check them out. And now let's head over to the team selections that you can use after FP2. And team 1 is very much still the budget team. Now off the bat, this team will set you back 100.1 million. So if you cannot afford this, or it takes you more than minus 10 to get here with all of your transfers, there are a few variations you can use which are just as good or just a little bit worse. Again though, for team 1, it very much is 7 out of 7 look like they're going to increase in value this weekend. Variation 1 will set you back 93.5 million, and this is for anyone who has Piastri in their team, or they're still below that 100 million threshold. Again, budget-wise, will do you superb. Variation 2, and now you can use either Norris or Piastri for this team, depending again where your team is. But the Norris version sets you back 99.9 million, so most teams will be able to have the team value for this. And the Piastri one, everyone will have, as this team will set you back 93.3. And this simply is just using racing balls instead of Haas. So say for instance you had racing balls in China, it takes you a minus 20 to sort out the rest of your team and then go from racing ball to Haas, meaning you just want to stick with racing balls. This is the team I would go for. And then the final variation, it's the exact same thing, just with Williams this time. Now this Norris team won't really work out for you, as you need 105.4 million to get to that, but the Piastri team is very much on, with this being 98.8 million. And again, it's for anyone who has to take more than a minus 20, because I would say getting to the budget team for just a minus 10 is still worth it. But if you have to take a minus 20 to get rid of Williams, say you have Doohan, say you have Gasly, those sorts of drivers, you need to get rid of them, then you could stick out with Williams as they still look decent for budget gain and points, and that means you can focus on the rest of your team that needs more improvements, such as the drivers who are definitely to get that minus 0.6 decrease. Then you have Team 2, which is very much focused more on Bahrain. But let's say you do want to go for the Piastri, McLaren, Mercedes team. You want to just go full push. You don't care about the budget. Realistically, like I mentioned, I'm not a big fan of it, but I'll still tell you exactly what to do if you want to go for something like this. Now, this team I'm showing right now, Variation 1, would have Piastri, Bortoleto, HADJAR, Behrman, Hulkenberg, McLaren, and Mercedes. Now, again, if you have a bit more than 101 and you have the transfers available, you could go from Behrman to Ocon, Hulkenberg to Ocon, or Hulkenberg to Stroll, as that's not a bad shout. However, the opposite can be said. If you physically cannot afford this variation of Team 2, which is 101 million, do not go near it, because then you have to bring a driver who will get that minus 0.6 decrease into your team, and then all of a sudden, it's not worth getting those extra 50 odd points to ruin the rest of your team. However, again, for anyone who has been extremely lucky since Australia and China, and you have a budget of over 104 million, which yes, a few teams will have if they've got it spot on, means you can bring in this team 104 million, like I mentioned, 6 out of 7 assets looking to increase in budget. Again, no, it's only for those select few that can bring this in with 3 or less transfers being used, so you don't get that minus 20 as well. And then finally, team-wise, we have this differential, which is sort of in the middle ground of going for points plus having that McLaren asset. And it's of course got Piastri and McLaren. Those are the two building blocks for these sorts of teams, as Norris is too expensive to do anything like this. And the big change, every single driver looks like they could increase in budget. However, you go out on Yuki Tsunoda. Now, FP2 results, it's still hard to go off if he is a good asset. And considering he hasn't got any points from other races, it will be hard for him to increase. As you can see, I believe it's 21 on the graph. It's quite a lot of points, depending on, he just needs to get driver of the day plus a top 10 finish. But at 101 million, plus a lot of chance for the rest of your team to go up in budget, if you want some sort of differential team, this is the one I would go for. Again, not really Antonelli anymore because he's only going up 0.3, so it's not really worth it trying to risk budget on some of your other drivers just to bring him in. for an extra 10-ish points that Antonelli could get compared to a B tier driver. But those are all the teams I'm looking at after FP2. And then finally, we need to talk about chips. Now, like usual, it isn't a sprint race weekend, so a lot of the chips won't be really useful here because you can get much better points at sprint race weekend, more racing, more points on offer. So the likes of Autopilot, Extra DRS, Limitless do not go near. Now, the one that's quite interesting is No Negative. If you still have No Negative and you haven't used it yet in your team, we had red flags in FP2, Alonso going off, Doohan going off, a lot of rookies, and potentially some rain on Sunday. Now, it is a little bit worrying because if there is no rain, there'll be less crashes, and maybe you'll want to save No Negative for a race where it's like 100% chance of rain, but it is looking like not a bad shout even in the dry to have No Negative this weekend, so keep an eye on that chip. Personally, for me, I don't think I'll be using it. However, let's see what FP3 says and keep an eye on that weather forecast. It could change my mind. And then again, final fix only really necessary if, let's say, Norris or Piastri qualifies P16, P17, and you know they'll be able to cut through the rest of the field. And then two drivers that have piqued my interest, now not really because of their FP2 results, but because of their situation in the game, would be Bortoleto and HADJAR. Now, even if you don't have them in your team, I would suggest keeping an eye on them this weekend. They are going to be crucial going into Bahrain. So if they just come out of Japan without a DNF to their name, they will be the most crucial assets most likely in the game. First of all, because they're most likely going to get a minus 0.6 decrease this weekend, and we're going to figure out if 4.5 million threshold for an asset last season is still the same this season with Bortoleto and HADJAR, because they will go past that point if they take the minus 0.6, or if there's just a cutoff. So that, first of all, means they could be potentially assets that cannot drop in value. That's a gold mine in F1 Fantasy. Plus, they did well in China. So if they just do well in Japan, they're going to be the cheapest assets in the game with the highest percent to go up 0.6 in Bahrain, as they both only really need to score around 0 to 5 points in Japan for this to be consistent enough to then look good going into Bahrain, meaning that then we could be seeing a lot of this sort of team going into Bahrain. Now, it is obviously going to be slightly different. The drivers and the constructors' prices will change, and of course, sometimes your budget won't go as exactly how you want it. But at the minute, you can bring in this team for 101 million. However, you obviously get Bortoleto and HADJAR, who look bad on budget. However, once they look good on budget, you can then all of a sudden bring in a team that is very much focused on getting that brilliant budget increase, while also being one of the best teams, if not the best team, for points as well. Video, now it's a bit of a weird one because there's not a lot of data to go off. I did my best and it still is very much clear cut before FP2 anyway, which drivers you kind of want in your team and not. But like always, if you want to join my F1 Fantasy League, it is the Fantasy Formula. You can find it on the featured leagues, and then anyone for F1 Predict, I will remember to do it this weekend. My code I'll put in the description. But as always, enjoy the weekend, enjoy F1 Fantasy, enjoy F1, and I'll see you all on Monday. Take care.